This is Agenda Alexandria, a nonpartisan organization that takes a look at the issues without taking sides. Whether it's the city's sewer system, education, public safety, climate change, or perhaps a look back into Alexandria's history. This is Agenda Alexandria, a nonpartisan organization that takes a look at the issues without taking sides. Whether it's the city's sewer system, education, public safety, climate change, or perhaps a look back into Alexandria's history, Agenda Alexandria is here to shine a light. What makes the organization so successful is our people, the people who run it, our panelists, our moderators, and of course,
Okay, thank you and good evening, everyone, and good evening to the people here, to the people online. I'm Ricardo Alfaro. I'm the co-chair of Agenda Alexandria for this season, and we're really thrilled to be here tonight at the George Washington Masonic National Memorial to talk about foreseeing the Alexandria of the future. However, before we begin, I do want to take a second or two to appreciate Simpson Development and the Zebra for being our presenting sponsors for this year. You can find out more about the Zebra, who are tonight cross-posting this live stream on Facebook. I also want to thank all the supporting sponsors, supporting members. We'll list all of them out at the end. It's a large list of numbers, and that's really great because this organization is really fueled by you. It's fueled by the members who enable these programs to happen month after month. Typically, we would have this program at the Lyceum. We used to have them here a few years ago, and we have been moving from one place to another, coming back into this hybrid / in-person mode. So again, I appreciate everyone for being here tonight and kind of bearing with us as we start to get our feet again acquainted with the in-person role. One of those changes is also you're noticing that for the people here in person, name tags are back, and we really appreciate that tonight was going to be a little bit challenging as we come back from just doing the virtual list to the labels. So I appreciate everyone's patience. We will get them right at our next in-person program. And on a note on that, our next in-person program is not happening until next year. Our November program is going to be all virtual. It'll be a conversation with students from ACHS around the usage of social media and the impact on education, stemming a little bit from the discussion that we had in September around the usage of technology and how the students were overall. We're taking a look into the usage of social media and how it has impacted their education. That program was recorded actually last year as part of the IT Commission's Cybersecurity Awareness event, but it'll run as it was recorded last year. And also at the end, I'll have a conversation. I'll be sitting down virtually with Dr. Elizabeth Hoover, the CIO of ACPS, to have a conversation and answer any questions that may be sent by the audience during that virtual live stream. Again, it's a virtual only program. We're not going to have an in-person program on November 18. With that, before moving on, I do want to also either come up to the podium for some very brief words to Sean Iyer, he's the Managing Director of Communications and Education here at the George Washington Masonic National Memorial, and thank you again for hosting us.
Thank you. The memorial would love to welcome Agenda Alexandria back to this place. We're so glad that you're here. The memorial is, as all of you know, it's a special place, a kind of a beacon, a landmark. You see the memorial in the distance, you know you're returning home if you're here in Alexandria. And as really the oldest museum in Alexandria, our collection, our core collection, opened as a museum over a century before this building was opened, before this building was erected. And we just, as you may know, celebrated a century since our cornerstone was laid a couple of years ago. I want to invite all of you to another anniversary that's coming up. February 22nd of next year is the 75th anniversary of the installation of the statue of George Washington in the main hall. Now, some of you may never have seen it, okay? If you've never actually been through here to see the tour and to see all of what's in the main hall, if you pictured the Lincoln Memorial and then make it into George Washington and he's standing up, that's very close to what you would see in our main hall. And that statue was dedicated in 1950 by Harry Truman, and we're going to have a Truman descendant present on that day. That event's open to the public. So that's going to be February 22nd, and more information will be available on our website about that. We know you're all dedicated Alexandrians, and of course, this landmark in Alexandria is something that's special to all of us. So thanks again for returning to the memorial, and we look forward to continuing to host Agenda Alexandria. Have a great meeting.
Thank you. Thank you again. And now, finally, I'll hand it over to Mary Harris. Before I do that, one final piece of housekeeping. For all of you here, you should have gotten an index card. If you do not have an index card, please let us know. But board members will be around distributing those. And if you have a question, the way that questions work is that you will write them down in the index card. And later in the program, we will be feeding those questions to our moderator, Mary Harris, also board member. And then she'll be introducing those as part of the conversation. For those online, please make use of the form that is, I think, on that side of the screen, on your right if you're looking at your screen. Make sure to put your questions. Please be as succinct as possible. I know that given that it's an online form, but actually what happens is that we transferred those into an additional index card and then also provided to the panelists. So please be brief on your questions. So with that, I think I've spoken enough. I'll pass it on to Mary Harris, our moderator for tonight. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. And I'd like to just mention, for those of you with white cards, I'm Mary Harris. I'm on the board of Agenda Alexandria, and I'm also the president of the North Old Town Civic Association. With me tonight as co-moderator, audience moderator, is Steve Davidson. Steve, can you wave? He'll be collecting all of your questions, and when we finish our panel discussion, he'll be asking them. So thank you for your patience on that. All right, we're here tonight to talk about the future of Alexandria. Not what it is today, but what it will become. And we've picked a year arbitrarily of the 300th birthday of Alexandria, which will be in 25 years. So in 25 years, well, let me just ask the audience, how many of you expect to be here 25 years from now? Go ahead, raise your hands.
Or in Alexandria.
In some form. Okay, thank you very much. So here we are. We're here in the 275th year of Alexandria. And as most of you know, things have changed a lot. So we have brought together, since its founding, of course, when we were just this little seaport with, boats coming in, and then we filled in the river and we built some houses on it, which don't give Jeff Farner any ideas. And then we started gobbling up land from our neighbors and grew. And from approximately several hundred people, we became several thousand, and then we became tens of thousands, and then hundreds of thousands. So that's over our 275 years. So what I'd like to do is to introduce our panelists who are going to be discussing what Alexandria might look like and our region might look like 25 years from now. I'm going to name them, and then I'm going to ask them to tell us a little bit more about themselves. So to my left is Jeff Farner, who's Deputy Director of the City Planning and Zoning, and also sort of the lead guy for strategic and long-range planning. I met Jeff when we were doing the Old Town North small area plan. Next to him is Eric Wagner. Eric is known to many people here in Alexandria. He is a former member of the Alexandria Planning Commission and was the executive vice president of MedStar Health, one of our largest business organizations in the region, and he can tell us more later. To my closer left is Mary Catherine Gibbs. And Mary Catherine is a land use attorney with Wire Gill. And many of the developments that you're seeing around Alexandria right now, Wire Gill is navigating those developers through the planning and permitting process. And she'll tell you a little bit more about that. But spoiler alert, Mary Catherine grew up here, and her mother is in the audience and is also on the Agenda Alexandria board. So there she is. Hi, Connie. And to my immediate left is Dr. Terry Clower. You know, we're happy about all things Scottish here in Alexandria. And so we've invited Dr. Clower because he's not from Alexandria. And if you're thinking of Alexandria, we have to think not just of the Scots who farmed our town, but also of that wonderful poet who told us in that poem, To a Louse, "Oh, what a gift it is to see ourselves as others see us." And I've paraphrased it. And so we've brought in Dr. Clower, who is a professor of public policy at the Schar School of Public Policy and Government at George Mason University, and also the head of their Center for Regional Analysis. So he knows what's going on in the whole area and can tell us how we look from the outside and how we fit inside the region that we live in. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is to ask each of our panelists to just tell us a little bit about themselves. You've heard what they do in their day job, but I'd like to start with Jeff. Jeff, where do you live? Why do you live there? What do you like about it? And, if you'd like to tell us a little bit more about your day job, you can start, and then we'll come around.
Sure, yeah. Again, I'm Jeff Farner. I live in City of Alexandria. I actually live in the Northeast community. I have been a resident of the City of Alexandria, I can't believe this, for almost 25 years. The reason I live in the city, I am a big believer for someone to do planning. I think it's important that being part of the community is really important, and I get to see and experience. I know many of the people in the audience, and that's really important to me, to be part of it, see it, experience, and I think that helps me anyway make better decisions if I'm part of the community that I'm also working in. And I think in terms of other things about me, again, I've lived in the city quite a while. I have a lot of sort of diverse interests. For those of you who probably know, I dabble in music a little bit, also dabble in art, as probably my staff knows, and I sketch too much and draw too much, and you'll probably see some of that in my office. So anyway, I'm happy to be here, and there was a conversation earlier about having conversations about change and how we do that, and I wanted to thank Agenda Alexandria because this is a conversation, and I think it's something we need to do more of and talk and also listen to each other to make better decisions. So thank you.
That's great. Can you just tell us what kind of house you live in?
Yeah, I live in a, I'll tell you where I live. I live on Michigan Avenue. It's called Fagelson Edition, and they have stone base, slate roof, built in 1939. And just a little bit of history. The Fagelson Edition was named after a former land use attorney I had the fortunate meeting, by the way, Bernie Fagelson, and I got to hear the story of how he grew up on a farm where my house was built. So that's real change, that he had a conversation with me about how he grew up as a farm. He used to ride his horse there. Then a house was built and I'm living there. And I think really part of our change conversation today is like, what is that change and how does that happen? And so I think that's hopefully part of our conversation today.
That's great. Eric, tell us more.
I've known Jeff for many, many years, and I just learned that story for the first time. And Bernie Fagelson, for those of you in the audience who knew him, and God rest Bernie, was, I would say, the dean of land use attorneys in the city when he practiced. And he was a person well known to all of us on the Planning Commission, all of you who are in civic associations and the like. Bernie was a guy who was often with us. I've lived in the city for 37 years now. And when my wife and I decided to relocate from Chicago to the Washington, D.C. area, because my job had shifted from Chicago to downtown Washington, There was little doubt in our minds that Alexandria would be the focus of our search for a house, because we had actually vacationed in the DC area and we had stayed in Alexandria, and we fell in love with the city during our hotel stay here. It was just a beautiful place, incredible architecture, lots of things to do, and the proximity to the district really couldn't be beat. So there was no question that we were going to try to live in the city. We're now in our third house. Our first two houses were in the Del Rey neighborhood. Our current house is in Northridge on Timber Branch Parkway. Just Alexandria is a special place, and that's what attracted me to the city. I'm here not because I was a healthcare executive with MedStar Health, but I'm here tonight because I was on the Planning Commission in the city for 22 years, and I chaired it for 9 of those years. So some of you have been on the other side of the table as projects were considered and approved, but I think we tried always to do something that I think Jeff alluded to, and that is to be able to disagree without being disagreeable, and to be able to have a conversation with people who differed with your own points of view. And I can tell you it was a top priority of mine when I was on the Planning Commission and when I chaired it in particular, that we listened attentively to those people who came to share their opinions about the projects that were in front of us, and that we could articulate when we made our decision something that others had said from the audience about those projects and why we either were going to change them or not. I think that's an important piece, and I wish truthfully that we had more of that today. I think that, and not just in Alexandria, but in our nation as a whole.
Thanks, Eric. Mary Catherine.
I hate to say this, but I might have lived here longer than both of you. I am not going to tell you how old I am, but I have lived in this city for over 45 years, and I spent 7 years in Chicago. So I didn't know that you moved here from Chicago. So I spent 7 years in Chicago and moved back recently. I live in Del Rey now, but I grew up in the West End. My parents still live in the house that I grew up in. I then raised my family in the West End before we moved to Chicago. My son went to Alexandria City Public Schools. And then we moved to Chicago and came back, and I rented a townhouse in Old Town North near you, Mary, and now I own a house in Del Rey. Trying to think of what I do land use for a living. I worked for one of the other preeminent land use attorneys in the city, Bud Hart, who was slightly younger than Bernie Fagelson, and he just retired, which is an amazing change for him. But I learned at the feet of a master, and we take very seriously the need to describe the projects that are coming before the community and before the city, to make sure people understand the benefits that come from them, and to listen to people. And actually, when we have interchanges with the community, that often results in changes and betterments of projects as we move forward. And while we're sitting opposite each other at this table, we don't always disagree. Not that we always agree, but it is always a conversation that's worth having, and it's a conversation that's maintained as a professional one in the city of Alexandria. So
That's great. I'm looking forward to hearing you disagree a little. Okay. Terry Clower. Terry, would you tell us a little bit first about where you live and your kind of house, and why you didn't pick Alexandria?
Well, actually, I currently live in Stafford County on a navigable creek that I can take I can choose if I'm going to fish off my boat or fish off my dock and go down. That's not, though, where we landed when we first moved here in 2014. If anybody's ever dealt with the university, you'll know that they're not exactly fast in their bureaucratic processes. So the summer of 2014, I had been ostensibly offered a job, but I was waiting on a signed offer. Foolish me wanting some signature on a paper, right? And so we finally got that, and we had been up and done a little house hunting in June of that year and had found a couple of properties in Alexandria that fit our needs. We wanted single-family home, a place for the dogs to run, so that eliminated a lot of possibilities. But we had found a couple. But we lost the chance on those houses because it took too long for the university to get me that letter. So inside of about 40 days, we sold a house and found another property up here in Fairfax and moved there. The connection with the water is that my undergraduate degree is in marine transportation. I learned how to sail ships, so naturally I became a professor of public policy. Pure straight line, right, as you can see, right? But it's still so that, you know, being on boats and stuff like that has a lot to do with it. But it's also interesting that what I do at the university, running the Center for Regional Analysis and the Stephen Fuller Institute, is getting to kind of understand how the economy works, what happens. I've been working in economic development for a long time, including in the private sector. After I worked offshore for a little bit, I went inshore and was doing site locations eventually for distribution centers. I'd managed private truck fleets, warehouses, all this stuff. And I got interested in why do companies choose where they do to locate and invest. And it's about a lot of different things. So I get to do so many different things during the day, whether it's transit, other forms of transportation, housing, all of it combined. And it's that being able to kind of step back a little bit, but also understand what's the competition, which is much of what we'll be talking about tonight over the next several years.
I think we will. And, you know, we're going to try to get, I think, all of your opinion about what we're going to look like 25 years from now, based on what you know and what you think. And I thought that maybe before we sort of jump into what we think will happen, I wonder if those of you, I'll ask Eric first, and then Mary Catherine, and then Jeff, what's the one thing in your 37, 25, 45 years in Alexandria that you've really noticed has changed a lot? So, just one place or thing or that.
Yeah, I think that it's a thing that I notice almost every day when I go out in the car, and that's the traffic. And at certain times of the day, it can take me 5 minutes to be able to make a left turn off of Timber Branch Parkway onto Braddock Road. And it wasn't that way when we bought that house in 2007, and it wasn't that way in the mid-teens. But the traffic in the city has just gotten horrendous, and it's, I think, because we're a built-up city. And you know what? I'll just give a regret as to what's been happening recently is I don't think we pay adequate attention to some of the infrastructure questions that come along with population growth. And the street capacity, unless we do what some other jurisdictions have done and tear down houses to be able to widen roads, we have a fixed capacity through much of the city's street grid. And I think we just have to recognize that people aren't going to jump to take the bus or the metro, quite frankly. I think the metro system and the bus system have never quite recovered from COVID. And so I think the traffic is the thing I would point to.
Go ahead.
Eric, I was just thinking about something. Yeah. So the Castle Systems, which is a building security and publishes the return to office stuff. Mm-hmm. You know, they're saying that we're still well below 50% return to office. We're one of the lowest in the country. Yeah. So I live down in 95 a bit. My office is in Arlington. What I really want to know, and I think maybe you have an answer, I hope you do, where are all these people going if they're not going to the office, and why are they doing it at rush hour?
Well, and I would wish to know that answer as well, but I'll speculate. And that is what I said before about the metro has never really recovered. Mm-hmm. I think people lost confidence in the ability of the metro system to get them from point A to point B in a timely fashion. And so despite the fact that the office vacancy rates in downtown Washington are still sky high, driving up the Shirley Highway into DC, mm-hmm. It's worse than I can remember it pre-COVID. And I think that's how I would answer the question.
That's great.
I hate to disagree with Eric right off the bat.
But go right ahead.
But because I do see the transit system in Alexandria as one of the better ones in our region. The Dash bus system that allows people to take that bus for free has so far exceeded their earlier ridership numbers. They're through the roof, and I do think people utilize that here in this city. I have noticed there are certain days when traffic is bad, but there are certain days when it is not. Particularly Fridays. I was amazed when I had to drive through downtown DC at 9 o'clock on a Friday morning, and there was not one backup. I got on the highway at Seminary Road and went all the way through DC, and there was just no backup. I think it depends on the day of the week, but I understand that that's your experience coming out of Timber Branch Parkway. I think we have funneled traffic differently in Alexandria. Certain roads used to be cut through streets, and they're not anymore, and so that may be one of the reasons why that's a particular bottleneck. But I think one of the things that I wanted to say was most different here is the waterfront. When I was growing up, we were told not to go to the waterfront for socialization. It was not safe. It was not pretty. And we spent decades, and you were, I think, instrumental in listening to people and figuring out, Jeff, as you did with the waterfront plan, how we could best utilize which was our first asset here as a city back in the 1700s, and now it is an asset again. And that's one of the greatest changes that I've seen.
And that's great, Mary Catherine. You know, some of you might have picked up this little article at the table, which is one of our Alexandria Celebrates Women. And this is the 20th century brothels that were on our waterfront. So thank you for bringing that. But yes, a lot has changed, or at least gone undercover. So, Jeff, what about you?
I have to say, Mary Catherine may have stolen what was going to be my answer. I would say two things. I think it is hard to talk. For me, it's very hard to talk about one thing that has changed the most and that I'm proud of as a city resident. But it's hard to ignore the waterfront. And I remember when we were talking about that and planning for it, and Mary Catherine's working on the power plan and continuing that waterfront connection. I remember when we were doing the waterfront plan, telling my friends and my wife, we're going to be able to walk along the entire length of the waterfront. And they're like, well, what do you mean? There are all these barriers, and there's a warehouse, and there's this other thing. And you can do that now. And I think all of us who were involved in that should be very, very proud, because it is amazing. And I have to say, I'm not sure when we were doing the planning, I always thought there would be a holdout, like maybe this doesn't happen, maybe there's a gap missing. The other piece I would say related to that, there was a ribbon cutting last weekend for the new North Potomac Yard Park. For those of you who have not walked that or experienced that, it is amazing, and it is a real amenity for our city, and I think it's a good testament of, I think, where infrastructure comes back to itself. And I have to say this fact because it always surprises me, and I always have to check myself to make sure it's right. We were founded in 1749, I think, as everyone knows. When do people think our first public park was created in our city? Any guesses?
1750?
Other guesses?
Not till the 1900s.
1950.
Wow.
So I hope we get into a conversation a little bit about what is the role of good government? And I think one of the roles of good government is to provide places like public parks, and good public amenities come out of priorities. And so I hope that comes up in sort of a Q&A. So long-winded answer, waterfront, and thank you, Mary Catherine, for stealing my answer.
Sorry, Jeff.
That's great. What I'm going to do at this point, because we all can agree, whether you're online, here in the audience, or here at the table, that things change. They're constantly changing. Right now, I think we have about 155,000 people in Alexandria. It's probably down a little from what it was maybe 5 years ago. And I'm going to ask you later where we're heading, but we have 155,000 people in about 15 square miles. Our little piece of this planet is less than 1% of the Washington metro region. So Terry, can you unpack some of that for us? What's going on here? What's the region doing? What's Alexandria's place in it? Where are we headed for 2050?
Okay, when do we serve breakfast?
Yeah, oh no.
So there is a lot. I'm going to take a little bit of, and with permission.
You can do whatever you
yeah.
want.
So I'm going to let's do a little interaction here. We're going to do 2 questions. All right. I'm not gonna write down anything, so we're not grading or anything like that. But the first question is, how many of you think that the economy of this region is going great, doing well? Okay. All right, that's a good solid majority. How many of you think we're doing kind of okay? No? How about thinking that we're actually not doing well? Okay, very positive outlook, right? Okay, now let's change the geography. What about, do you feel the same about the city of Alexandria, its economy? Doing great. Yep. Doing okay? Yeah, a few more. And not doing well. Okay. This region, after having a good run of about 25 or 30 years with the growth of federal government and the shift to contracting and everything else, has done very well for a long period of time, up until more recently. Over the last, say, 10 years or so, our growth has been substantially below the national average. In 2022, we actually had gross regional product growth for the metro area that matched pretty much the national level. But if I dug into that, back of the envelope kind of calculation, about half of that growth that year was from the data centers created in Loudoun County. Just Loudoun County, not Prince William, not anything else. So if you get down to it, our core growth has been really slow for a long time. We are not as competitive. We have domestic outmigration out of the region, peaked out at about 69,000 more people voting with their feet and choosing to leave this area to go to other places in the U.S. Don't know what the number is specifically for Alexandria. Obviously, it'd be much less than that, but the trend continues. The latest data we had that ends for the 12 months ending in June of 2023, it's a little bit better, only about 46,000. We are not growing in part because we are losing our talent. And anecdotally, I can tell you the talent that we're losing, those people that we're losing, these are not retirees going off to Florida for some unknown reason, maybe because they like hurricanes, or the Outer Banks, maybe because they like to see their house get washed in the ocean, but whatever it is, what we're losing are the 30s to 50s who have families that simply cannot find housing that they can afford in this region. And we are losing that skills. We have an unemployment rate that recently ticked up for Northern Virginia as high as just a little over 3%. For those of you that didn't sleep through the econ class, remember that they used to say about 5% was, just, kind of the normal churn of business. Within Alexandria, today you have 20,000 fewer jobs than you did at the end of the Great Recession. The jobs that we actually in this city are, and in fact the industries in this city that are actually growing, food and beverage stores, nursing and residential care facilities, waste management and remediation, warehousing, storage, of course that's your fulfillment centers, right, for all the stuff we're ordering on Amazon these days. A little bit in some financial sectors for funds and trusts and stuff like that, but that's only 130 jobs total. Furniture stores, wholesale electronics brokers, and home appliances retailers. None of those I would call high value added jobs, high wage jobs necessarily. So the things that we need to think about in moving in the future is, do we have the tax base in Alexandria to do the kind of changes? Because one of the things when we move into the future, the waterfront, great asset. You give us 6 inches of sea level rise over a short period of time, and think about how much money you're going to have to spend to keep it, secure along the waterfront without inundation happening on a pretty regular basis. My point of all of this, though, and I'm not trying, I know, some of you know that I inherited Steve Fuller's job. He was known as Dr. Doom. I try not to be completely like that, and here I am giving you what's not. The fact of the matter is, we have lost competitive edge in some key sectors. We're losing competitive edge in cybersecurity now because as it's shifted more and more to AI, we're losing that to the Silicon Valley. We actually, the rest of the nation on average, is creating more federal jobs than we create in this region. Alexandria itself has half the number of federal jobs that it did at the end of the Great Recession. That's gone down by 9,000 jobs, federal jobs. Those jobs average probably about 110 to 120,000 each. That's a lot of purchasing power that you're losing out of the local economy. So with all of those challenges, we have, though, the ability to reshape our future, but it's going to require us to make changes and do some things that probably are not real comfortable. If your idea is that you can look at your neighborhood and expect it to be the same 25 years from now, if it is the same 25 years from now, we will be in serious trouble because we will not have the places that are attractive to young workers and young families to grow and to stay in their communities. We'll still get them to come in for a period of time right after college, but it's keeping them in the long run that will be part of our challenge. So with that, Jeff will tell us how we fix all that.
Well, if I could, I mean, that's one of the reasons that Alexandria is at the forefront, I think, because our city council has a strategic plan, or had a strategic plan. They're actually about to go through it again. We're going to have a different council that's coming in January, but they've stated, and at least I've heard them talk about wanting to go through a strategic planning process again. They're very forward-thinking in that respect. I think having the Virginia Tech campus open with the stated purpose of creating more students, more professionals at the professional level that can serve those jobs that you're talking about that we're missing. I think that's a key, and that's going to be important. But it is planning for something like that, and we wouldn't have the waterfront the way we have it if we didn't plan for that. I think you're very right about in terms of the job numbers, obviously, but a big number, I bet, of that decline comes from the Patent and Trademark Office, which just halved its presence in the city of Alexandria, and that's a lot of jobs. And so that's, I can completely see that. But if we don't start planning for how we're going to deal with those things, then we're going to fall behind.
I think there's no question that we need to plan for those things. And I think, perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, we could say we were too heavily dependent on federal jobs in the city. And none of us could predict that there was going to be a pandemic without getting into politics, but the Trump years were not good for federal employment. And so we lost a number of jobs in the region as a result of that. And, Terry, you've talked about the price of housing. Well, I suspect many of us in this room are homeowners, and we're not anxious to see the value of our homes drop. And I would perhaps disagree a little bit. I think young families are looking for the ability to own a single-family home in a single-family neighborhood as opposed to being in a townhouse or being in a condo. A lot of them are looking to take that step up, and they're going to have to look outside the city of Alexandria based on pricing of our real estate here in the city. I think it's important, though, and one of the premises that we had, I'm not so sure that it's as currently applicable, but we were trying to keep a balance between employment and citizens, right? Employment and people who reside in the city, and tried to balance those things so that we would have an equilibrium. People could live and work in the city. We would not have as much cut-through traffic. My sense is that we've backed a little bit away from that, right? And the focus has been on the housing side of the equation, and how do we fix the high cost of housing? As somebody who was trained in economics, in my graduate program, I'm skeptical about our ability as a city, which is relatively small even within this region, to influence that decision. Governments have tried and tried and tried all over the country to try to fix housing prices, and I'm unaware, perhaps you could tell us that I'm wrong, but I'm unaware of a jurisdiction that has actually fixed that problem.
So there's a couple of things, and you make a couple of good points, but one of the things is I would never advocate for anything. I'm a homeowner. I don't want home values to go down, but what we have to do is get enough housing supply in the region so that we can slow down that rate of growth, because the really hot, very popular regions that are economically kind of kicking our tails now, places like Charlotte, Atlanta, Dallas, Phoenix, etc., Nashville, go on and on. Their prices are escalating pretty high, right? Now they're continuing to build, and they're addressing those needs by building. We have, you're absolutely correct. Alexandria, 1% of the land area can't fix it, and that's actually one of the real challenges that you have, is that two things, and this is kind of where the outsider coming in. You get more than, let's call it 100 miles, call it 200 miles, whatever, away from here, and the distinctions that we hang on to so tightly in this area. We're not Arlington, we're Alexandria. We're not on that side of the Potomac Ocean, right? We hang on to those. Those don't matter to people outside this region. We are the national capital region, the DC metro, whatever it is. And a lot of the things that we wind up fighting over, if you will, are things that are just kind of holding us down. And what I would tell you is, and this is a part of the challenge, I think we can all agree that what I said is that Alexandria is not doing great. They are but you're in a position of, doing things about it. If the District of Columbia becomes a hollowed out core, a hole in the donut for the region, it's going to be real hard for us to have any long-term success. If Montgomery County, who still hasn't recovered the jobs from the pandemic, is not successful, that lack of success will spill over for us. These things happen and all, but housing, there's lots of things we can do. There's a lot of things that we can talk later about, in terms of some ideas, but the simple solution is going to have to be one way or another. We have to have more units available.
I want to switch the topic a little. One thing you mentioned was talent acquisition, and I want to talk a little bit about that, because I think one of the things we see hiring employees is people come here because they can and they want to be here. And I think one of our competitive advantages as a city, as a region, are the amenities we have and being able to attract that talent. I think you raised the other point of how do we keep that talent? And I think that is housing affordability. And I think if my own opinion, and we've talked a lot about housing affordability in our city, I think it's something as a city, as a region, we need to address, because we need to keep that talent here once they are here. I did want to talk about Virginia Tech. Mary Catherine mentioned that. I think one of the great things about that, in addition to having that be in our city, creating other spin-off things from that, it's also creating students who hopefully will stay in this area. And they're going to open business, they stay here, they're going to stay in our city, they're hopefully stay in our region. I think that's going to happen. I'm a little more positive, I will say. I think there's a lot to offer. I think we need to put the tools in place to address the issues we all see. It is not unclear what the issues are. I think the question is how we solve it.
It's very interesting. I picked up sort of this little article because I Google a lot. And it's Alexandria in 2050, creative, diverse, and growing. And this is what our Economic Development Agency thinks we will be in 2050. And to pick up on what you have all said, basically, and this is Stephanie, sees that the two major anchors in Alexandria will be Potomac Yards, Virginia Tech, and the other would be the new Inova Hospital in Landmark. Now, I don't know how many jobs either of those really create for our region, but definitely people working there. So, I mean, that's sort of the 2050 vision, is having those two places, and sort of, I think she throws in Hilco, which is the old power plant site along the waterfront, that would be a multifamily setting with there. So what do we think about that? Is that enough to keep and attract workers if the federal government is kind of in decline?
I'm not sure that I would agree with Stephanie's assessment, for example, of the Inova Hospital project. Inova Alexandria Hospital exists today in the city. It's got employees today in the city. They're building a new campus. That's wonderful. We'll have a new hospital. That's great. But I don't know that that becomes a big boon to employment in the city. I can't speak to the rest of the development that is proposed for the landmark site and how many new employees versus new residences that's going to create. But to me, that site is not going to be one of the anchors. I agree entirely with Jeff on the Virginia Tech element of things. I think that's super exciting, and I think for both of the reasons that Jeff has given, I think there's a great opportunity then to keep the talent, the students who graduate, and to keep them as residents of our city and to continue to help us grow. I think the Potomac Yard as a site, I think it's broader than just what Virginia Tech brings, right? I mean, there's a lot of other plans. You can't help but see those things happening there. And on the other side of Route 1, as I understand it, Inova is actually going to put a major outpatient care facility. Right,
Yeah.
I mean, so that's all new employment as near as I can tell, and it helps to anchor that site and tie it back in with the rest of Potomac Yard. So,
I want to build off that for a second. So one of the things Eric just mentioned was the Inova Healthplex in Oakville Triangle, which is on Route 1. And I want to mention that because it's an interesting facility. And I would argue 5 or 7 years ago, that didn't exist. That was a use that didn't exist. Essentially, it's a hospital, and you can stay there 24 hours. So I think one of the things for me, as I think about how do we plan for the future, the one thing we know, uses that do not exist today will exist in 5 or 7 years, and how do we plan for that? And I hope one of our conversations that we get to is how do we build that into our planning? How do we build that into our future? Because I can assure you there are uses in 5 or 7 years that are going to come into our city that don't yet exist today. And I hope as a group we have an opportunity to talk about that, because I think it's huge, and I think we need to plan for it. I am optimistic. I would also say, and I see it in my neighborhood, I see it in our city, people who are working remote, they are employed. Obviously, they're employed. They're working full-time from their house, and you see it in our retailers and our restaurants, who are benefiting from that for a daytime population that didn't exist. And so, again, 5 years ago, that didn't seem like a possibility. It is a possibility, and I think it's going to continue. So I hope one of the things we talk about as a group is how do we build in that flexibility to adapt to change? Because it is, someone mentioned this earlier, it is going to happen. How do we plan for it, and how do we be intentional about it?
Well, it's by making sure our zoning ordinance isn't so stagnant that we can't. It's by making sure that the zoning ordinance isn't so stagnant that we can't adjust without having to go back and change every text that is in our current zoning ordinance. We have to make that flexible. And I would say the one thing I might point out about the Inova Healthplex, or the Inova campus out at Landmark, while it is an existing facility on Seminary Road, it's going to get much bigger. And that's why they had to leave their facility, because they didn't have enough space with all of the easements around the hospital for them to expand. And the new cancer center, I think, is going to be much more expanded from what they have at that campus. So I think there is a great opportunity for that kind of an impact. There's over 5 million square feet of development that was approved at Landmark for both mixed use, mostly residential except for the hospital, but there's also retail there. And I think that is going to spur on the businesses that come adjacent. You know, the residents that are going to live there are going to need restaurants to eat in. They're going to need stores to shop in. I am of an age that I saw Landmark when it was a open air mall. Then I saw Landmark as an enclosed mall, and now it has been completely torn down. So this is a rebirth of Landmark again that I hope is going to rejuvenate the West End, which every time that happened at Landmark, it did rejuvenate the West End. And so I'm really hopeful that it spurs the new development along that Van Dorn, Duke Street corridor as we move forward.
Well, we can already see that things that are happening today and things that have been put in place will probably be here in 25 years. So can I just take a second to ask each of you, and you can take a wild guess, we're at 155,000 people now here in Alexandria. I don't know, Jeff, you can tell me how many people work in Alexandria. There's 75,000 housing units, I think. How many do we think will be here in 2050 or 2049? How many people? Because it is population that's going to drive really our resourcing and planning. So anybody?
I looked back 25 years ago to see whether we could see where we've come from. You did the same thing, Eric. And we've grown about 1% a year every year, with the exception of 2020 and 2021, where we had the people leaving. I think every urban environment had people leaving because they wanted to go out west or do something else if they could work remotely. They want to work remotely where they can see beautiful things. But it's been about 1% a year, and I don't know if we'll continue in that vein, but that's a pretty good indicator that's likely where we're looking. I think we have the Council of Governments have identified a certain level of residential units that are necessary in order to keep up with that population increase. We are, I think, on target. I think that's John Chapman sitting out there. Are we on target, John, in those limits?
I think the Council of Governments projects by 2050, the whole region will have 1.5 million more people and 1 million more jobs. Now, they made that estimate a while back. How many of them will be in Alexandria is another story. So just to park the actual number. Yeah. If we were 1% of that, that might be like 10,000 people over the next.
Well, actually, I think that if I'm not mistaken, the mayor said that he had committed to the Council of Governments that we would take on 25,000 people out of that total increase in population. I believe that was the number that was talked about. Now, whether any of those numbers come to pass, I think based on what Terry was describing, I think there's a question about that. I think there's a question. Mary Catherine talked about the work from home capabilities and people moving out to whether it's more scenic areas or areas where they could afford, quite frankly, a larger house, with a yard. And they don't have to commute every day and put up with the I-95 traffic, right? I mean, I think that created a different situation, perhaps, than when those projections got put together. I mean, it may be 1% a year, but it's quite interesting. When I moved here 37 years ago, or close to it, in 1990, our population was 110,000 people. So you think about the growth from 1990 to now within a finite bordered city that was largely built out even back in 1990. And I think that's one of the distinctions, Terry, when you talked about Charlotte and places in Texas and so forth. Well, there's a big difference between those places and the city of Alexandria. We have finite borders. We don't have big undeveloped parcels of land the way they do, in those largely rural areas. And so our capacity for growth to me, is going to be the rate limiting piece. But I would say if the mayor is committed that it's 25,000 more people, that's not a bad way to think about it, that we could be up to 180,000 people in 20 years. There are no occasions that I know of, and Jeff can correct me, where the city is looking at things and saying, okay, we'll tear this stuff down and we'll put less there. There's a case in point, there's a redevelopment that's going to take place at the corner of Braddock and Beauregard. 24 units are going to be removed, 283 units are going to be put in its place. You know, how many people are going to live in those 283 units versus the 24 that exist today?
Well, we're pretty much a bedroom community right now, so we're creating more beds. For who?
We've planned it so that we essentially have a development crescent in Alexandria. We essentially focus on our transit-oriented nodes. That's where we've identified higher density, where there's not just metro, but buses as well as metro. So that's where we're focusing our density. But while we don't have significant large tracts now, we have a lot of redevelopment parcels in Alexandria. We have a lot of old warehouse parcels. We have a lot of older areas, and I'm not talking about the old historic district. I'm not suggesting we're going to be doing anything there, but there are places that are ripe for redevelopment, in particular the almost 19 acres on the Alexandria waterfront that Mary and I have worked very hard on, and Jeff has as well with the redevelopment of the power plant. We have found places in the city where we have targeted density. I mean, as you recall at Potomac Yard, we fought for years about what the level of density was going to come to Potomac Yard. And now we have another 7 million in Potomac Yard North that's potentially to be developed there. That's redevelopment. There's portions that are vacant, but that's redevelopment here in the city. And that's, I think we really have been very focused on targeting where we put that density. But we're going to need it if we're going to be able to sustain those increases that you're talking about. That 25,000 increase is about what we've done in the last 25 years.
So Terry, if we build it, will they come, that 30 to 50 age group? What are they really looking for? I know me, I'm retired. I'm in a high-rise condo. Love it, love it. You know, but...
It's a really interesting dynamic, and we don't know what the attitudes are going to be in the future. But there was some interesting work that was done by Virginia Tech's Housing Research Center. Must have been 2017 or 18, and they were looking at the millennial generation, and the millennials, just as was said earlier, they want single-family detached homes at about the same percentage that previous generations wanted. You know, and let's face it, living kind of in a downtown or a dense urban environment where you're living above the bar, that can be a lot of fun. It's less fun if you've got a 3-year-old in tow, right? You know, so you're picking up and needing this. And certainly I understand the difference that, you know, if you're talking about areas where you have lots of land on the outside, and we have lots of land on the outside we could choose to land in, but we box some of it in with some local policies. But within the area, I think it's going to be relatively slow growth. There will be some densification. But when folks talk dense, they think of these pictures, and you've seen them before in a magazine cover that makes it look like we've got nothing but, you know, 30 and 40-story high-rise apartments and stuff like that in the area. And that's not where the future is going to take us. It is going to be achieving some density probably from townhomes where you might have had an office building before. You've done some of that and some other places. I don't think the population is going to grow that much more. I think I'd see it slow. It'll still creep up some, but you're going to run out of land out of the 15 square miles. The real challenge to do that, though, is if you look at the balance of tax base, what proportion of your tax base, at least as we do land use management now, that's residential versus commercial or industrial, some other use. The higher that residential component gets, the higher the tax rate is on average.
Let me just challenge you on 2 points right there. I think you made the comment that we're going to run out of land. I think that is not true. I think, particularly not in 25 years. If you look at, Mary Catherine talked about our growth rate being generally 1%, and I think that's right. So if you look at Eisenhower East, Eisenhower West, Landmark Mall, the area around Landmark Mall, Alex West, we're doing an upcoming plan on Duke Street. There is a lot of commercial and transitioning land for us to grow, particularly in the next 25 years. I think after that, I think there's a conversation about what happens. But if you look at our typical absorption, our typical development, most of our absorption can happen in that space and in that time. I have seen the report that talked about how people are trending with building typologies. And I would also say that people self-select to be here for a particular reason. And I think one of the great things about our city is there are different neighborhoods. Eisenhower East is very different than Delray, which is very different than Northeast, which is where I live, etc. And I think that is a great thing about our city, both moving through it and living in different spaces. You have different options. And I think that's going to continue. I think the challenge, coming back to housing affordability, is how do we have folks that can afford to stay, either aging in place, candidly, or younger professionals, younger employees who are working in our businesses. How can they afford to stay and live here? And I think if we are really going to lean into our diversity piece, which I think we believe, I think it is important we address the housing affordability thing as a region, as a city.
If I could.
Sure.
I think I can see where going with that. I'm still, kind of about keeping the tax base balanced and doing that. Yeah.
So one of the things that I think we there has been a discussion, certainly probably as long as I've been here, is does new development pay for itself? And short answer is office pays more, residential pays slightly less. 60% of residential is what we get to keep, minus services. Office is roughly 80-85%. So as we think about what new development is paying for, yes, it pays for itself, plus services that enable us to do other things. And I think that's an important distinction as we think about new development and how we fund and make improvements. And that was based on a fiscal impact study we did. So it's minus schools, it's minus services, all the sort of typical services that I think one would think of. And that's online, by the way, so that's something that one can review. But I think it's often a question we get, does it pay for itself? Short answer is yes.
I'm just going to, let me just put a fact in here, if I can, because, I Googled a lot and I read some stuff, and so I'm going to do it. But the Census Bureau has come out, and this was just 11 months ago, saying that their forecast for growth is much lower or much slower than it was in the year before. And a lot of that has to do with immigration. And this is not a political point, but it's really how many people are coming into the area, and decline in fertility and smaller families. So they're looking at sort of an overall, we'll have a slow growth to 2050. By 2060, it'll drop off again to 2080. So, and most of that is due to pretty much smaller family sizes and a result of the slower pace of population growth, because there aren't a lot of people who either can move or move. So that means that we have to be much more competitive, even though we've got the government. So I think that
Go back.
yeah,
I'd like to pick up on Terry's point about the tax base. I think it's
absolutely.
I think that and I've seen, Jeff, the work, I've heard about the work that has been done. I have to tell you that when I look at what my real estate taxes have done in the city over the last 20 years, it would not bear out that all of this new development that we've had in the city has paid for itself. Because the increase in my taxes, and I suspect all of you in the audience, I hear some murmurs, is they have gone up faster than the rate of inflation on an overall basis, right? And if all this development was paying for itself, that wouldn't have happened. No, seriously, I think that you just have to come down at a very macro level and say, how has it paid for itself? Or are we saying that our city council spent money like drunk sailors?
I think what it
is
says,
that
hold
we
on.
need,
We had a lot of, you mentioned it yourself, Eric, we had a lot of unfunded infrastructure improvements that were not being paid for or not being made. And we are now making up for that and have had to over the past several years in order to be able to fix things that are not based on the new development. They're based on 100-year-old infrastructure in the city that has been failing. And so a lot of that is related to that. I would say you look at any new development, you look at the amount of real estate taxes that are generated by it and the number of services required by the people that are in that new development, and the numbers that Jeff is talking about bear him out. Those developments are paying for themselves. There are other needs in the city.
I understand the other needs, and in fact, I served on the task
I know
force
you
for
did.
the city council that looked at how we had underinvested in our infrastructure.
Yep.
And I was one of those who said we do need to make these investments.
Right.
But I'm going to tell you that my taxes were going up at a similar rate before we recommitted to that. It is not as if it's only the last 5 years that have seen my taxes go up that much. What I'm trying to do is agree with the point that Terry was making, that we need to balance the amount of residential development with the amount of commercial development so that we can maintain a tax base that is equally supported by both of those pieces. And by the way, one of those things about that is that it, as I understand it, it helps with the cyclicality of what happens on one side of the equation versus the other, right? And that's an important piece so that we don't put the full burden of the cyclical nature of the economy onto the homeowners in Alexandria.
Agreed. The issue is how many commercial developments are moving forward in the city, because business does things differently now, as we've talked about. The people are just not coming back to the office the same.
Right, but that's
And
where
then-
Jeff's comment, which is so on point in terms of how do we look out now,
Right?
10 years into the future, and say, what does that need to be?
So one of the things that becomes real challenging, and if we look at this region overall, and I don't know the stat particularly on this one for what's going on in Alexandria, but we keep seeing we're adding housing units, we're adding. Okay, how's that? The magic, okay. All right. So we are hearing about a lot of housing development, you know, and seeing housing units, and there's some single, and let's not go to Stafford or you know, Spotsylvania or Frederick, Maryland, or anything like that, but within lots of units coming in, but most of those units are 1 and 2 bedroom units or studio units. We're not building many family-sized units in this market across the board. Now, you guys may be doing a lot better, but I don't know. And so, you know, there's one about how, and the challenge is that when you start building those family size units, that number of whether or not it pays for itself gets harder to do. The other thing that becomes challenging, and one of the things, folks, you can be very proud of, is the transparency in the city of Alexandria about your housing goals and what you're trying to do with housing. There is no community in this region that pushes out the data, very readily available on the websites, about where you are on your housing goals. And I think it's really important to even talk about some distinctions, because you mentioned it, Jeff, about, you know, people who are working in the, you know, I said that restaurants and things like that are your fastest growing businesses. Where do those people live? You guys have done a really good job of meeting the housing goals that were set in that agreement with the COG back in 2018, I think it was, for affordable units. In other words, folks below 60% AMI. In the workforce, though, those folks that have kind of middle jobs, 60% to say 110, 120% of AMI, depending on how you do it, you guys targeted that you were going to have by 2030, I think it was, something like 2,250 units available for those kind of affordability. So far, as of the last data period on the website, you've created 367. Now, you've hit your affordable housing goals for the lowest income component, right? Just about, not quite there, but very close, and certainly will hit it by 2030. But one of the challenges that we get, and it becomes even more important for the balance that I'm kind of advocating for, is that you need to be building houses that are appropriate for families. And that still, when one of those folks, you know, if those folks are a couple of people that work in the entertainment business or some of the fastest growing segments, And you're always going to have cross migration within the region. You know, folks that live a little bit further out, live in Fairfax, live in down maybe Dumfries or something like that, and can come up, right? But the idea is getting those around. A little interesting fact in economic development, site location consultants, and of course all of this is kind of getting blown up now, but they used to say that the effective labor market for your site, for your business, was on average, and I stress average, a 30-minute commute. Now, of course, we know around here 30 minutes, some days it gets you down the block, much less, you know, any place, right? But you know, you get that sense that it does matter. We lose the chance of getting some businesses because the business looks here and just says, I can't be competitive on a national basis if I pay people enough to have housing within that site here.
One of the things that's important is that the last thing that was just approved at Landmark was a townhouse development. So we are building family units in the city of Alexandria at the same time that we're building multifamily units.
Well, that's great. I know that a lot of our audience, this has been a phenomenal discussion, and we didn't even get to half of the questions that I had, you know, such as what do we do when the Potomac River rises, you know.
Well, good thing we have a waterfront plan that has
Rises
an implementation policy
2
for
feet.
protecting us from that
Yeah.
implementation,
So
from that
there we
influence.
go. So what I'd like to do is to take some questions from our audience. Would you do that? And we're
course.
coming over. Steve Davison has picked a few. We won't be able to get to all of them, but we will keep all of them, and we'll try to answer them later.
Yeah, we got it. Is this thing on? Yeah. We got about 12.5 questions. They were mostly in the categories of housing, density, education, and future-proofing of Alexandria. I'm going to select a few that are sort of representative. One of the things that has been brought up in one of these questions was diversity of income represented in the availability of housing. And the question is essentially, when we have developers proposing development and going through the planning process, is there a mechanism in place to ensure that we don't get a plethora of luxury condos and we do get a balanced and well representative mix?
So I'll talk generally. So I think short answer is yes. There are policies and practices in place. I think we have challenges in Virginia about legislative authority to require affordable housing, but one of the ways we are able to do that is with density. And with additional density in some of our small area plans. For example, the Alex West plan that's currently a draft plan. With all new density, there's a requirement for 10% of that to be affordable at 60% AMI. That's still yet to go to council, so that's in process. There is also a developer contribution policy, which is voluntary. Which all new development that come through, there's a recommendation for affordable housing as well. So there are policies, practices in place, and our housing department is actually working on the housing master plan update right now. So stay tuned on potential other policies and practices as well.
I could take maybe a slightly different perspective than what Jeff has articulated. You said it, Virginia law does not allow jurisdictions to do much in the way of evaluating the income levels that are required to buy or to lease units. And I think it's fair to say, Jeff has said, Alexandria uses those tools to the maximum ability. That's a true statement. And I think but it largely targets people 60% AMI and below. And I think you heard Terry say earlier, we're doing kind of okay there. We're not doing okay with the people that are in kind of a middle bracket. And the way I heard your question is that the developers want to build luxury condos, luxury townhomes, that then become unaffordable to people who are of more modest income, not low income, but more modest income. Kind of the folks that Terry was talking about, in their 30s and 40s. It makes it hard then for them to afford to live in the city. And I don't think the city has the tools to do that. That's a market decision. That's why it's so hard, in my view, for any jurisdiction, any government, to tackle this issue of housing affordability, because you can't tell somebody that they have to make the things that they're going to build have to be able to be sold to somebody who's making $110,000, $150,000. That's not within the power of government to do. You're trying to, in that instance, buck the whole marketplace around us, and it doesn't work. And so I think we're using the tools that we have, but as far as trying to, build something other than luxury townhomes and luxury condos, you're just not going to see that here, or I think anywhere else.
The one thing I would note that the Office of Housing actually, I think, works very well with our affordable housing developers here in the city, particularly Housing Alexandria. And one of the most recent projects that Housing Alexandria got approved and is actually under construction right now on Seminary Road is homeownership opportunities of townhomes that are for sale for people making between 70 to 100% of the AMI. So that is happening. When you get a new on-site affordable unit in any new development, the city's Office of Housing asks that those units be for sale to people making 70 to 100% of AMI. So while it's not predominant, it is happening, and it is happening right now.
Could you say what the AMI is for those?
Area median income.
No, what is the number?
Oh.
How much does
This is
someone make?
125 for a family of four for this past year.
Something about like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, for those in our
125,000.
audience who,
So when you're talking about stuff in the affordable range, you're not talking about people who are unemployed just on the government dole or anything like that. This is people who have jobs, they're just not high-paying jobs, but it's the folks that we deal with every day in our service sectors, in our retail shops, and things like that. There's one of the real things that it becomes interesting. There are jurisdictions on the other side of the ocean that have done the thing about trying to mandate rent controls and things like that. And while they will tell you that, we've approved 30,000 housing permits, yes, and the number built is a big goose egg.
And we don't have that authority.
Right. But the point is that the idea that you're just going to tell developers, hey, you have to do this for us because we have this goal, and the answer is no, they don't. They don't have to build here. They can build other places. And there's a lot of what we do here. Oh, and by the way, while we're doing this, we're going to make you go through the ringer, and it's maybe good for some business, but we're going to make you go for the ringer through 2 years before we can give you that permit.
okay, have we got another one here?
Lots of other questions. So the next most popular category of question was density. And I'm going to sort of summarize many questions. We are a very dense city. We have a finite square mileage. And as we add people, we also add cars, we add kids, we add a lot. The question essentially comes to, when are we dense enough that we can say, we're there, we don't have to keep adding people?
Well, Terry.
Yeah,
You want Terry to go?
Oh, you want? Well, okay, I don't know the answer, because I tell you what, the thing that we haven't really talked explicitly about is the way the entire structure of our economy is in flux now. The data economy, maybe think of just artificial intelligence, and you can, some of the chat GPTs say that's all kind of overhyped at the moment, but it will catch up. But that is changing the very nature of the way we do work. And it's going to be very hard for us to sit here and even say in 25 years, what is work going to look like? And where will that work happen? Is it some combination? There is still the social dynamic, but how many days a week does it take to be in a centralized place to get that social benefit that you get out of working together and having colleagues? So I don't know that it's a real easy one to say. And what is the shape of the built environment going to look like? In that, I will say that we do get to a point, and it's less than what some futurist would say. I mentioned earlier, this notion that we're all just a bunch of, have these high-rise, super high-rise buildings and all that. It won't look like that. But this is also to where you're in the real challenges. You're Alexandria, you're 1% of the land mass. Our competition, what matters for us is what's happening in the region, and then what is Alexandria's piece of it.
And what happens to our waterfront? with CDOT.
Talk about the density question, because we get this a lot, and I think maybe I even started here, which is how do we manage change? How do we have a conversation about change? And how do we implement that change? And I use the example of my house, which was a farm, and in the 1930s, it was constructed as townhouses. And I think most people would see my neighborhood and be like, that's a beautiful street, and it's a great neighbor that contributes back to our city. I hope they would say that. I used to have is it still hanging up? I used to have an article in my office. I want to share this. And it was 3 townhouses in Old Town, and it was a newspaper article about how it was going to destroy the character of Old Town. It was from 1854. And so I think our challenge is, how do we have new development, new buildings, new parks that contribute to our city and don't detract? Because I think oftentimes we're focused on, is there a new thing? And I think the framing of the question is better of, is that new thing contributing back to our city? Because I think one of the things we all care about this city, and I appreciate how deeply we all care, we all live here. And I think we care deeply. And I think, to me, it's a framing of, is it contributing back to who we are as a city? And I think there are ways to do that. And so, again, I think density is part of that conversation, but I look back as, is it giving back to our city?
Great.
And I would say that as a very typical lawyerly answer, it depends. And it really does depend on what is coming and what those new jobs look like, and how millennials and Gen, whatever they are, zeros, are, how they're going to be living their lives. But one of the things you talked about is it giving back, is that density giving back. The reason that you mentioned it wasn't a park in the city of Alexandria until 1950, you know what gives you parks in the city of Alexandria? Development. The parks in Old Town came from development. We're adding another 5 acres of parks at the power plant site from development. The park at Cameron Station, Armstead Booth, as well as Benman Park would not be there without the development that is there. Like that is one of the main public benefits of development in this city, is the amazing park system that we have throughout the city.
If I could, I just want to piggyback and first say that I agree with part of what Mary Catherine said. So, Mary Catherine, that's the one time tonight.
We got it. We found it.
And the reason I say it depends, if it's a site that is vacant, or it's got a warehouse on it, and it could be developed and put dwelling units on it, housing units, technically that increases the density in the city because the borders of the city haven't grown. To me, that's okay. But if you came into Jeff's neighborhood and said, okay, we've got a developer who wants to tear down a whole block of townhouses and put up a 9-story building that's got, 300 apartments in it, I would say no, that's not a good increase in density in the city, and we shouldn't do that. And I think Jeff's posing the question of, does it contribute to the city or not, is the right question, and that's, to me, why it depends.
The other thing, and it kind of goes along, so the attorneys will say it depends. Well, we say on the other hand as economists, right? But the other is, frame that in, tell me whether or not we have a well-functioning regional transit system, because that will dramatically affect what the density can be.
That's great.
Particularly, you look at the townhouses around the Braddock Road Metro Station, where it wasn't the highest and best use of that land there. And so that is a typical example of where, yeah, we did plan in this city to say that those townhouses could come down for us a little bit more dense development.
All right, we are getting up on our 8:30 closing time, but I think we're going to go a little bit over that. We've got one more question from...
On? There we go. So the one topic, we've covered housing, we've covered density, we're talking about the future. There are other aspects of the future that we haven't touched on. So there are several questions here that say, how are we preparing for the impact of climate change beyond the waterfront? And what are we doing to make sure that we have necessities in the city, such as car repair, hardware stores, and all of the other businesses that we absolutely need to have and we want to make sure are there so that people don't have to drive 30 miles to pick up a screwdriver?
Well, I'm not to that question. How do we make sure that we've got all of those stores, those services available in the city? I'm not sure that there's a way that we can do it, and we've lost a lot of them. We had the conversation a little while ago about the Oakville Triangle, and about the Oakville Triangle and the redevelopment that's taking place there. I can tell you that in the 1992 master plan for the city, that area was specifically focused to stay as an industrial zoning so that it could provide a bunch of uses that residents of the city need. Unfortunately, that's gone, and you'll have to drive, I guess, to Fairfax County to be able to access some of those things that used to exist there. I think that, and I believe that a lot of the other industrially zoned parts of the city are targeted to be redeveloped. And we're going to lose some of these things that today they serve our city and they serve our residents. And so the way that you keep those things is you don't rezone it. You don't put an incentive for the person who owns the property to come in and ask for a rezoning. Because we will become just a place where there's offices and there's retail and there's residences. And if you need those other kinds of things, you're going to have to drive 30 miles to go get them.
What we did do, though, in the Eisenhower West small area planning process, where a number of those industrial sites are located, is that you provided incentives and you provided goals for maker spaces and those types of uses to be able to fit within any new development. We haven't seen it yet, but those goals are in place in particular areas of our city where we do have a significant amount of industrial land.
Look at the businesses that are in a lot of those industrial spaces today. It was probably about a year ago, we did an inventory of what are the businesses that are occupying those spaces. In our city, we have industrial zone land. We don't have a lot of industrial uses. Particularly in Eisenhower West, it is daycare, it's dogs, candidly, it's breweries, and it's entrepreneurial space. It is people coming in who are renting at a particular price point. And so I think as we are talking about change, that space in and of itself has also become valuable. And so it is also morphing. Someone said this, there's a lot of other topics I wish we could have covered today. This is a sort of a broad reaching area. I wish we had more time to dive into that, but it's a very good question.
So let me offer something, just since we're getting down to the end, just for food for thought, for consideration. This has a different perspective if you think, how would we do it if we took the existing land use regulation system and did it a different way and restructured tax structure? Now, we have a problem about this is where the Dillon rule makes it real hard for us to experiment and to be at the forefront. In part, there's a piece that Jonathan Aberman will have, I think it'll come out sometime this week in the Business Journal, where we're comparing, at least from an economic structure or some of our challenges, is much like the innovator's dilemma. We've done it the same way for long enough, and we're afraid of losing something that what we have before, and not going to the next one. Remember, Eastman Kodak developed digital photography and then let others run with it because they didn't want to honk off their people that, the shutterbugs, right? So we have a little bit, and I would challenge us, and I don't have all the solutions here, but what if we think about, form-based codes or something where you worry about what the built environment looks like as opposed to what is the economic activity there? Reshape the whole thing and then think about how do we best structure a taxing that generates the revenue that's going to be needed to pay for the services and amenities that the population wants for a really competitive place. And if we were at the forefront, not trailing, not the 50th community that did it or the 100th community that did it in the country, if we were at the forefront of that, we'd be on that leading edge that would solidify our first mover's advantage.
Respond to that, because I think I'm not going to respond to the tax piece, but I will respond to the form-based code. So form-based code, just for everyone else, is essentially a zoning policy practice, which is, it doesn't regulate necessarily what's in the box, but sort of more the box. In our city, we have sort of modified form-based codes, sort of. And I think that's a good practice. The one thing I really wanted to say tonight, and I think it's something we as a profession, we as a practice, buildings that are built for one singular use. And I think for me, as we think about the future, we are going to have to build buildings that are adaptable. And if you think about buildings on Washington Street, they were built as residential, then they became commercial, then they became residential, now they're something else. We have buildings that are adaptable. Our city hall was a courthouse, now it's City Hall. So I think as we think about buildings evolving and changing, we need to think about the flexibility of the building itself to evolve to different uses, and I think it's going to be key to being successful as a region, as a city.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you, audience, for all of those questions. Before we leave tonight, I'd like to give each of our panelists an opportunity to just give a little close. I want to know if on Alexandria's 300th birthday, will George Washington be proud of us? And why? And I'm going to start off.
Oh, good. I get to go first.
Well, who are we? I mean, you brought up the question of who are we as Alexandria?
I'm an optimist, and so I think the answer is yes. I think the DNA of our city, and I think in large part what was created by the layout of our grid will be intact, and I think it's part of our DNA. It's what we try to do with new plans. I think I'd like to say yes, he would be proud of, I think, what we've done with the legacy of our city.
Jeff, I usually am an optimist as well, and I would like to think that we'll make the decisions over those next 25 years that would allow George Washington to be proud of what our city is on the 300th birthday. But that's going to take a lot of vigilance from all of you in this room and from our elected officials to always keep in mind, what is it that makes Alexandria special? And that's a neighborhood-specific thing. There's our history. The street grid could go away if people do the wrong things in terms of development and the wrong things in terms of approvals. So I want to stay optimistic. But we are at an inflection point where our community, all of you in this room and your neighbors and our elected officials, need to make a series of good decisions in order to make it so George Washington can be proud of us.
And his whole family.
Right. I would say that George Washington adapted himself throughout his life consistently through facing new challenges in his life. And so I think what he would see in our city is when we find a challenge, we figure out a way to adapt to it. And that is what would make him proud of what we do. We are not the same place that we were in 1749. We wouldn't want to go back to that. We should celebrate our history, but don't make it so that that history keeps us stagnant. And I think you're right. It is important. These next decisions that are going to be made, they're going to be very important. But we should not be afraid of change, because we have changed and adapted since George Washington. And we should continue to make those changes and those adaptations to deal with who we are now and who we are becoming.
Kind of an unfair question for you, Terry.
Oh, there are no unfair questions. They're just ones that I kind of ignore, usually coming from students. And we are at an inflection point, but for many different reasons. Much of what Alexandria is going to be facing is actually not within your control. If I look at right now, if I'm just looking over the next 25 years, what could occur in the next couple of weeks could have a major difference. What if 50% of the federal workforce were relocated to other states? And of course, the other is, with artificial intelligence, do you even need that 50%? So instead of 375,000 federal workers in this region, what if there were 100,000? What would that look like in the dynamic? Now, we have the capability of adjusting to even those kind of extremes as long as we're looking forward and not looking back. Now, part of the thing that you have, the great advantage is that even if the region as a whole does not do well, and what I've tried to caution people about is right now, over the last 10 years, we have been on a pathway to perpetual economic mediocrity. It is very much that we will be okay. The Pentagon's not going to relocate. You know, things like, so there's some base and there's some stability here. It's whether or not we are okay or whether we thrive. But I will tell you that you guys are in an enviable position, because even if things go the wrong way and you start seeing those pressures will occur in those outer jurisdictions first, because you are a highly amenitized, very pretty, all the different neighborhoods. You'll be one of the last to see the negative effects. But what I challenge you folks in is then to take off the parochial, we'll be okay, we don't care about the rest of you. No, understand that we are all in this together. And that's where I think we have the opportunity to make somebody like a George Washington as a historical figure proud, recognizing that it's not just our parochial interest about us just in Alexandria or in Tysons or in Montgomery County or anyplace else. It's where are we going to go together.
Wow, thank you. I think, audience, do you think our panelists gave you their money's worth? So I'd like to thank all of you and to thank our audience too for coming tonight. I think this is a discussion that we need to continue, and perhaps we'll schedule, maybe even have all of you back again to talk some more about how we'll deal with the challenges as we look forward. Because, sorry, we're not going back. And hot mic here.
Hello. Okay, there we go. I want to thank everyone again for coming tonight. One piece of housekeeping as well. If you really enjoyed the program, it will be available on demand immediately once we end the live stream. You can go to agendaalexandria.org and you can watch it there. Where we also have all the programs that have been that we've put together so far for this season. That includes our September program. That includes an early October program, which I will also give credit to our former chair, Rod Kukrow, which was along with Advanced Arlington and GMU about governance. So please take a look into all those programs at attendees.org. If you are a member, thank you again for your patronage. If you're a supporting member, thank you a lot as well. If you are not a member and want to consider joining, you can do so by either talking to us at the end or going to attendees.org. And again, thank you everyone for coming tonight. Have a good night.
This is Agenda Alexandria, a nonpartisan organization that takes a look at the issues without taking sides. Whether it's the city's sewer system, education, public safety, climate change, or perhaps a look back into Alexandria's history, Agenda Alexandria is here to shine a light. What makes the organization so successful is our people, the people who run it, our panelists, our moderators, and of course, our members. Agenda Alexandria is a member-funded organization, and we invite you to become one today by visiting agendaalexandria.org.